So, Sophie, what from a reframe perspective, I think we like to look at it as the sort of great realignment and how what that creates from an organizational perspective. So, for the listeners, what is that sort of concept of the great realignment as opposed to the great resignation, and why and how have you spun it that way?
Yeah, it's sort of just building off what I said, which is around, we've had to change and our work practices have had to change. And in that, we maybe haven't realigned back. So organizations are potentially still wanting to think or behave in a way that they were, or they haven't deeply spent the time understanding what employees need and what the priorities are. And ultimately, I think while they have evolved and changed in some cases, they may be just heightened. So it creates this opportunity to go, okay, these things that were potentially still important pre the pandemic have become more important. And it just creates that opportunity for, much stronger alignment with employee needs and organizational needs. And it's this idea around how do we create thriving and resilient workplaces? And when we've got, sorry, you can say something?
Well, it's just on that point, I suppose sorry for cutting you off, but it sort of segues quite nicely into, what are organizations doing, or what can they do? What can leaders do in this time of realignment? And I'm keen to flip it onto your own sort of tips and, advice around that. So what can you tell our listeners today in terms of that point?
Yeah, so I think, from a psychological well-being lens, we know that from the research, and that this is pretty, substantiated, that you're looking at connection, and you mentioned autonomy, that, that the focus around how do we really drive what's important from a psychological well-being lens. And the other one is mastery. So, mastery being, am I able to grow and develop? Do I have access to work where I can apply my strengths? From a connection lens, there's a big focus on purpose and meaningful work, genuine connections with employees. There's a really interesting study that McKinsey just put out, that looked at the misperceptions, or the divide between what employers think employees want, or why they're quitting, and where employees are saying the reasons that they would leave or intend to leave are. And employees are much more focused on the relational elements. So they're saying things like actually being recognised by my organisation, but also being recognised by my boss, the fact that I need to have great working relationships with my colleagues. These are flexibility around how I work. These are really important. And that wasn't valued in the same way that organisations valued those things. So they didn't think employees wanted those. They were much more focused on compensation. They were much more thinking that people were leaving because of their health problems. And so it's much more of a transactional lens that their study demonstrated. And they had, I think it was 250, mid to large scale organisations provide this data, of which they were saying we are seeing voluntary turnover. And so it's just this mismatch between, and that's where the opportunity is. I think organisations need to firstly look at their voluntary turnover numbers, watch them, but also start to look at their well-being and engagement data. And interestingly, in the research, well-being is often measured as job satisfaction. And we often, from a psychological lens, say they're both important. They're measuring different elements of well-being, and that well-being in the research is often measured as satisfaction, which is a bit like I'm enjoying myself, and maybe there's a sense of calm and I'm not too stressed out, when actually we also know from the research that part of well-being is being stretched and growing and being challenged, which is to that point around mastery. So engagement, it can often talk to the commitment to an organisation, but also that sense of vigour and vitality and energy around work. And that's where, so measuring those two and looking at that. So if your data is telling you that your well-being and your engagement is low, then that may also start to pose some challenges.
In your
sorry,
opinion,
say something.
what skills, specifically skills from a sort of leadership perspective, do you think, in this current environment, do leaders or professionals need to be working on to be more relevant and improve themselves?
Yeah, and I think there's two lenses to that. Like, I think what the data is showing is if people want greater mastery, they want connection, that all of these elements are really going to be very much driven and experienced by how their leader shows up. So, there was a recent study actually done by EY that looked at, the importance of empathy. And actually, I think in this study of about 1,000 people, nearly half of those people said they had left because of a lack of empathy of their boss, either from a work relation or a personal relation. So this idea that leaders need to be able to navigate and understand the whole person is increasingly important. And empathy being not just being able to sit down and have difficult conversations, that's part of it. But there's an openness, there's a transparency, there's an element of being fair, there's an element of doing what you say you'll do. So there are some, I would say, leadership skills around authenticity, around how do you create inclusion, how do you respond in an empathetic way, how do you live that and breathe that, and how do you create an environment where people feel safe to have these conversations around mental health, because it's increasingly becoming something that's important and relevant in the current context. I think there are things that organisations can also do. So we're seeing a lot of organisations are starting to put out things like wellbeing days or pillow days, which are like mental health days. So designated days outside of public holidays where it's just about taking care of you and acknowledging hard work. We're seeing organisations allow people to go back and work from anywhere in the world coming out of the pandemic, so they can be close to family and friends after that time, to sort of drive some more of that connection that we talked about. So we're seeing that play out. A lot of organisations saying, please go and do that and make sure that we're valuing your well-being. So I think that the practices, either from leaders or organisations, to ensure that their people's well-being is being taken care of. I think the other part is, how can you give employees the skills to take care of their own well-being? Because in a lot of ways, it's a joint accountability. Organisations are not 100% responsible for their people's well-being. I mean, I think, if organisations started enforcing people to do 30 minutes of exercise every day, like you've seen in some schools in America, you might have uproar, like, how dare you make me exercise? But we know 30 minutes of exercise every day is going to make a significant impact on your well-being and your health. So there is some accountability, but we do need to make sure that people have the tools and the skills to manage, obviously physical well-being is one, but there's financial well-being, there's social well-being, there's career well-being. All of these things are really important, and how do you navigate that?
Incredible points there, Sophie. Thanks so much. And I think my personal leadership journey or development journey in that space has certainly made me look at myself from a vulnerability point of view, and providing that empathy and being really, truly transparent to my staff and peers and colleagues. So, really resonating with me, certainly on that point. I'm keen to, certainly something, having recruited for you and understood your business, you adopt what you call it, or what is termed as a strength-based approach, and it's highly sort of visible throughout your recruitment process as well. What is that? Why does it benefit your organisation, and what can you share about it to the listeners?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think the research would tell us there's a couple of points that it's hitting on in that sort of framework I mentioned around connection and mastery and autonomy, in that when people are aware of their strengths, they're able to apply them at work. And we know that people who are able to apply their strengths at work are just much more fulfilled, much more engaged. There's a concept called flow, which comes from a German psychologist, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. Don't ever ask me to spell it. But he's demonstrated actually that when you are in this state of flow, you're fully engaged in your work, and that's actually aligned with using your strengths. And interestingly, from a wellbeing lens, the neuroscience is now showing us that when people are in that state of flow, their nervous system is balanced, so they're able to better manage stress and pressure when you're able to use your strengths. So people being able to know their strengths is one part, But then the other part is actually you have to actually create a workplace where people can apply them, and that match around, strengths and skills and values is actually hard, and it's not easy, and no organization gets that perfect, but being able to address that quickly and move on. We've worked with an organization who would pay people to leave in the first 6 months if it wasn't right. And so they were open to having those conversations, said, we will pay you a bonus if this is not right for you, because we care about you and we care about your colleagues and we care about this organization. So I think there's that. I think the other part the research shows is that when people who work with each other know each other's strengths, it drives a much stronger sense of connection, inclusion, belonging, collaboration. It's a really safe way for people to get to know each other in a work context without feeling like you've got to be overly vulnerable or share things you don't want to share. And it allows people to collaborate in different ways, because we can stereotype people quite quickly, and strengths is a way where it's a combination of what you love and what you are naturally good at. And that is from a positive psychology lens, just allows the focus to be very solution orientated.
Love it. Clearly an expert in that space, and I thought it was some really good sort of takeaways within that. So look it up for anyone else who is keen to adopt it. I think we've covered a lot there in terms of tips and advice, certainly around driving that psychological well-being, the mastery piece you've mentioned, looking at connection, empathy, vulnerability, mental health, and also that strengths-based approach. Is there anything else you would add just in terms of final tips?
I think the autonomy piece is a really interesting one, which I think is really on the minds of a lot of organisations at the moment, which is how do we navigate back, coming out of lockdowns? How do we create flexibility? And I know it's going to look different in different industries. Not all organisations can create a hybrid model. We're seeing a lot of our larger clients create a much more flexible approach, with sort of saying, come back this many numbers of days, and those numbers of days being less than the numbers of days being at home. So more like 1 or 2 or 3 days in the office at a max, and it being seeing the office as more of a collaboration space. So even think about Inkling, we've renamed our office the CoLab, and it's a space where you go for collaboration or because you want to just have a new environment to be in. I think even in industries that can't create that with an office environment, it's thinking about how can you drive autonomy, allowing people more flexibility with their roster potentially, and that autonomy will be really valued in the current environment.
Amazing.